Welcome everyone to Drisha's full program and the final class in this series on caring for others, the Torah and ourselves, Jewish perspectives on the ethics of care by Sarah Zager. In this session, we'll use a series of aggadot to consider other places where care might appear, including infertility, pregnancy loss, and mourning. We'll use these sources to explore how analyzing these experiences can expand our sense of what care and religious obligation looks like. With that, I'll turn it to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Evie, and thank you for all of your support through these 3 sessions. It's been a joy to work with you. And have your smiling face in my Zoom window each Sunday. And thank you to everyone for coming along this evening. So as Evie said, I think in the end we're only going to get to sort of part of the story here, but what I want to do today is start off with a brief reminder of the model of care ethics that we saw last week in Mara Benjamin's recent book, The Obligated Self, and then we will kind of use that as a jumping off point to suggest that there are actually, like, she points to one model, but we can actually think of a much wider range of experiences as resources for thinking about care and also for thinking about religious life and obligation. So that's kind of the broad sweep of where we're headed. So with that, I'm going to share screen like so. Okay, somebody give me a thumbs up if you see the share. Yes, hooray. Okay, great. So last week, what we looked at was a kind of debate between Mara Benjamin, who's a contemporary scholar of Jewish thought, also an alumna of the Drisha Scholars Circle of yore, and her kind of debate with Levinas about the idea that ethics shouldn't be an abstract thing. It should be instead focused on attending to the particular needs of particular people. And she really focuses on the experience of caring for her own young children. And there are very specific needs that, you know, a kid will have. So that's the picture that she presents, and she links it up right at the beginning of the book to the Jewish practice of wearing tefillin. Wow, right on cue. Avigail Halpern enters as soon as I say the word tefillin. Those of you who know Avigail will understand that this is a fitting moment because Avigail is a deep lover of the mitzvah of tefillin. So here we go, right on cue. So I want us to just read this passage and kind of see what Benjamin is doing, and then I'm going to give you a few texts that will kind of explode it to a much wider range of things. All right. So this is, I think, basically the second or third paragraph of this book. The weekday morning ritual of tefillin is practiced by religiously observant Jews, stages the key narrative of the people of Israel. During prayer, small boxes containing the words of scripture are wrapped in black leather straps to one arm and the crown of one's head. So far, so good. The daily act of quite literally placing the words of Torah on the body is understood as a fulfillment of the biblical command to study and remember the words of Torah. This all should sound to this audience pretty familiar. Bind these words as a sign upon your hand, let them serve as a symbol between your eyes, etc., etc. Okay, so here's where things are gonna get kind of more important. I'm gonna skip down to about here. By wrapping oneself in tefillin, the worshiper reenacts the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt, and assents to it. So there's something that goes on by you're putting these boxes on your body, then you're assenting to a certain kind of narrative and being part of the covenant that comes from that. All right, but she said religiously observant Jews, but she's left the gender piece out. But we know that for most of Jewish history, mostly men wore tefillin and very few women did. So she's going to say there's an alternative model that most Jewish women have practiced that is still about obligation, but it's about a differently structured kind of obligation. Jewish women, like many other women throughout the centuries, have intimately known their own distinctive form of boundedness. They don't need to bind something literally onto their arm. The boundedness of living with, being responsible for, and attending to children. As with tefillin, this boundedness is marked on the body, carved on muscles taut from the weight of carrying children, etched on the face in lines of sleeplessness, worry, and delight. engraved in the visceral response to the cry and needs of one's child. Child rearing is a commitment in which love flows between mothers and children. And is expressed in the responsibility that women take for caring for their children. So now she set up this nice opposition where tefillin is sort of the male, stereotypically, way of enacting obligation, and mothering is the stereotypically female way of enacting obligation. Right, so she's going to say, but whereas the Jewish male self is told in the imperative, right, just telling you, go out and do something, to bind himself to the words of God, a living human being gives maternal selves this imperative countless times a day. So Jewish men have to take on something to bind themselves to the word of God. Jewish women have children who then tell them to do various things, and that's actually kind of analogous to the experience, to the word of God, right? So like last week, for those of you who were with us, we talked about the fact that Benjamin in a certain way is saying that like the demands of a young child who's saying like, feed me right now, have in her mind a theological status that's like not unlike something like the Aseret HaDibrot, which is a kind of wild, like big theological claim. So there are these two different models. To bind himself to the living words of God, a living human being gives maternal selves this imperative countless times a day, inscribing them with the dynamic Torah of their child, right? So for Jewish women, the child sort of themselves confers a set of obligations that are basically like mitzvot. Men's subjection is aspirational and metaphysical. Men want to be bound to the Torah, so they enact that by literally strapping themselves to the Torah, and they hope that they will kind of aspire to this metaphysical connection with God. Women's is genuine and concrete. So I want you to see in this last line the way that she set these up as oppositions, right? Aspirational and metaphysical on the one hand, and on the other hand, genuine, i.e. not to do with aspiration, already there, I think, and concrete, sort of really physicalized in the world in a way that this metaphysical obligation is not, right? That's the kind of, that's the sort of opposition that she's set up for us. Now then we might ask, well, wait a minute, like, isn't tefillin actually really physical and concrete? And like, that's the whole point. There are these straps, you really gotta strap them to yourself. It's not just a kind of totally abstract thing. In fact, it's particularized already. That might be true. And we might also say, as she kind of at various points wants to say in the book, that in fact, there's something metaphysically or philosophically significant, religiously significant about the relationships we have with children. So it's never going to be a kind of hard and fast story, but it is nonetheless she's setting it up as an opposition. Questions about that before we move on, or comments? So far, so good. Okay, so what I want to do for you in the next like few minutes is a little bit explode this sense of both kind of what tefillin are and how that might cue into gender in interesting ways. So for that, we're going to have to take a brief detour into the world of Hilchot Shabbat. Okay, so in Masechet Shabbat, there's a long set of Mishnayot and then Gemarot that list all of the things that you can and can't carry out into the public domain. In general, you can't carry things into the public domain. But then there are things that are like sort of, but you can wear your clothes, right? That's sort of taken as a given. Then there are kind of interesting boundary cases about like, is X really clothes? Is X an object? What if it's like somewhere in between? How do I know? So in the series of these Mishnayot, we get this Mishnah, which talks about boys going out with their knots. Okay, so the Mishnah says, Habanim yotzim b'kishurim. They go out with knots. That's what we get from this Mishnah. Not very much. That's very helpful. It's very confusing. Like, what does this mean? Okay, and then there's also princes can go out with their bells, and even the Mishnah kind of already says, oh, but these are things that were kind of currently in practice, and they were the things that people normally kind of wore, but still not 100% clear like what they actually are. Yeah? All right. So the Gemara usefully has our question, which is, what on earth are these knots anyway, right? Okay. So the Gemara asks, Ela, Mike Shrim, what are these things? Ki hada amar avin bar Huna, amar Rabbi Chama bar Guria, ben sheyesh gaguim al aviv, notel ritzuah mina'al shel yamin, v'kosher lo bismolo. So Rabbi Chama bar Guria says, okay, a son who is longing for his father takes a string from his shoelace, from his right shoe, and wraps it on his left arm. So if you're not left-handed like me, what arm do you put your tefillin on? On your left arm. Okay. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, simin ech tefillin v'chilu fasakanta. And the other way around is bad. So you have to put the child has to take the shoelace from the right side and put it on the left side, and not the other way around. You can remember this because it's connected to tefillin. Okay, so what do we make about this business about shoelaces? Well, the question is, what is the son doing? The son misses his father, and there's a kind of procedure for the son to follow in order to, excuse me, in order to act, kind of publicly enact, physically enact that sense of missing their parent. It's unclear to me. It seems like it's a child, because it's always described as banim, but I'll leave open the possibility it doesn't have to be a young child. Seems like it probably is, but there's something kind of rhetorically or connected in our imagination between putting on tefillin and the practice that young boys have when they miss their father, who seems to be absent, right? It's not like they go out and they go like, I miss my father, I'm going to go see my father. They wrap this string around. So on the one hand, you can read from the practice of wrapping the string to wrapping tefillin as saying wrapping the tefillin knot is a way that you enact your longing for God and the fact that you miss God as a kind of father figure. But I also, right, so that's a little bit of a different model of what the practice of putting on tefillin is than Benjamin has. It's like, oh, this is a practice that's mostly about enacting my membership in the people. But what's going on here for the child? The father is not there. And it's not even clear that the child has some hope that the father will be there down the road. The child is somehow enacting and kind of nursing almost their sense of loss for their father and their sense of wanting to be with their father when they might not be able to. So that, I think, already starts to kind of disturb our initial picture of like what tefillin were for in this little metaphor, and maybe then can help us reshape Benjamin's picture, which is all about men as these kind of formed actors who are then trying to communicate with God. Here we have a young boy who is yearning for a parent. All right, so in the discussion in the Gemara about this Mishnah, we also get all kinds of other things that the rabbis think are sort of generally related, excuse me, to this practice of wearing knots. Okay, so the rabbis teach this nice little braita, and here's the braita. Tanu Rabbanan, yotz'in ba'even tikuma b'shabbat. Okay, we can go out, Mishum Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, one may go out with what's called a preservation stone. The question is, what on earth is a preservation stone? Preservation stone is a stone. If you look in the Shabbat Koren Gemara, there's a nice little picture of various ones that have been found in archaeological sites. That is a kind of amulet designed to prevent miscarriage, or thought to prevent miscarriage. So the idea is, Rabbi Meir says you can go out on Shabbat holding this item. In general, you wouldn't be able to go out on Shabbat holding a stone, but for this item, you can. Okay, why are we allowing this? What is this about? It's a way of, again, in a similar kind of way, I think, to the son, it's a way of the woman performing her like strong longing and desire for somebody who's not there, or not yet there, right, for the health of a child. Okay, at least at the moment from Rabbi Meir, it's at least, it seems like it's a fetus. Okay. Amru af b'mishkal even tikuma. They said, oh, even a counterweight to the even tikuma is sufficient. So now it's not only, oh, you can carry this amulet that like is supposed to prevent miscarriage, but in fact, you can carry a thing that represents the amulet. It's not even the amulet itself. It's just some rock that's the same weight. Okay, fine. Vilo shehifla. It's shehifila, sorry. It's not, it doesn't have to be someone who has previously had a history of miscarriage. It doesn't have to be that she has some like scientific basis to be afraid. Just the fact that she seems to be concerned or seems to want to protect herself with this practice is sufficient. Ela shema tafil, even just the fear of it is enough. Vilosha ivra, and it doesn't even have to be that that she is pregnant, right? It doesn't have to be that the woman is pregnant to start with and then is worried about miscarrying an actual fetus that she knows is there. Rather, ela shema titaber vitapil. Rather, it's enough that it's possible that she might become pregnant and then she might miscarry. So either this could be she doesn't quite know whether she's pregnant or not, right? That seems like it's a possibility, but the rabbis are opening up the idea that you can carry this stone and kind of embody this act of longing, or even potentially, I want to open the door for care for this unborn child, or imagined child, even if there's not actually a pregnancy there. That doesn't really matter to the rabbis. What matters is this, and even if it's not really that rock, just a rock that kind of represents it and is the same weight, is sufficient to actually for the rabbis to say you can go out and carry this on Shabbat, even though normally that would be prohibited, possibly even biblically, depending on how you carry it precisely. So the rabbis are making a lot of room for performing some form of care for a being who's not actually there. Okay, well, let's just go one more step. Amar Rav. Yemar bar shlema mishmei da Abaye, v'hu da'achin ve'itkal. Baye Abaye, mishkal da mishkal, mai teku. Okay, so Rabbi Simlai, sorry, I misread. Rabbi Simlai said in the name of Abaye, this applies only when you have a stone that's really the same weight. So the counterweight has to have some kind of physical relationship to the real stone. Abaye says, okay, what about a counterweight to a counterweight? So you have the original Even Tikuma, the original preservation stone, then you get some stone that's the same weight, and then you actually get a third one that's the same weight as the second one. So now you're really at far removed from the original thing. The rabbis say, we're not going to answer that question. That's kind of, we're just going to let that question remain open. So what do we make of this text? Kind of in the normal course of rabbinic law, the rabbis would not have allowed anyone to carry the stone at all, or they may have made some kind of exception where there's some kind of obvious medical need. But there isn't that here, at least not in all the cases, right? Because we don't have to have some previous kind of well-grounded fear. She doesn't even have to be pregnant, or even like there's no language of even suspicion. It's just the idea that she's longing for something that's not quite there. So I want to open up the possibility that actually what's going on in this text is, or at least we can read it this way, maybe it's not what's going on in this text for the people who wrote it, that there's a kind of care that we do for people who aren't present to us. Whether that's people we miss who are absent, which is an experience I think all of us are having a lot these days, or someone whose presence you hope for but actually isn't in the world yet and doesn't have the specific kind of features that, you know, Mara Benjamin's like embodied child is going to come and give you commandments, but that nonetheless that person either imagined or lost permanently or just gone for some other reason, is nonetheless someone for whom you can care in some meaningful way. And there's actually kind of that experience itself shapes the actor and makes a difference. This is the suggestion I want to take out of this text. And hopefully that will let us reread this initial story where like, right, as we said up above, men's subjection is aspirational and metaphysical, and women's genuine and concrete. Actually, for the woman carrying the stone, genuine, let's leave out of it, but there is something abstract, or at least not totally present to her, or absent, that she's hoping for, but isn't maybe there, or at least isn't known to be there in some kind of direct way. That like the dynamic Torah of this here child who has these specific needs might make available. Does that make sense? So I think this sort of disturbs the initial kind of lineup of the male and female versions. Questions about that? Are there things in the chat that I've missed here? Okay, great. All right. So what I want to do next is suggest to you that actually not only is it the case that the tradition kind of makes legal allowances for caring for people who are not present, but actually that experience itself is central to the tradition. Like, that's a big claim, but I think I can by the end of the hour convince you of it, at least to some degree. There is that form of yearning is actually like built into the metaphors that we use to talk about redemption itself, right? So the original kind of, right, like if we started out with a sort of Yetziat Mitzrayim theme of like Exodus from Egypt, and that is the model of redemption, there's another model that's in biblical sources that is linked up to this kind of expectation as care situation. So what I want to do in our remaining time is present that model to you and spend some time sort of seeing where it pops up in text and thinking about it. Okay, good. So I think many of us, right, have spent some time with the kind of opening narratives of the Torah, especially recently, know that like there's a kind of repeated trope of the imahot struggling to conceive children. But that narrative in its sort of afterlife in the prophets, and we'll see in Psalms in a minute, becomes like one of the central metaphors that's used to describe like Zion or Zion waiting for its redemption. So there's a way in which this starts out as a kind of a story about Sarah and Rivka and the whole thing, but by the end is actually a metaphor that's used to describe redemption as a whole. So kind of one classic place, which we get from, it may be familiar to you from the Haftarot following Tisha B'Av, is this verse in Isaiah. Roni akara lo yalda pitzchi rina v'tzahali lo chala ki rabim bnei shomema mibnei be'ula amar Hashem. So, right, shout out, O barren one. That's usually the word, not like no longer the preferred term, but here we go. Right, who bore no child, actually, shouted for joy, even though you didn't have like birth pains. You will actually have more children, you sort of forsaken wife, let's say, than the one who has, right, mibnei be'ula, is those espoused, is what JPS gives you, which is bad English, right? The children of one who is married. Okay. So here you already see that the barren woman is a kind of trope that's being used to describe redemption. Now, on the one hand, you might just be like, oh yes, this is a nice trope. It's a biblical like metaphor. We're not going to read too much into it. But I actually want you to lean into this a little and like imagine that what's going on is that the biblical author here actually wants you to think that the experience of the akara who then bears a child is the experience of redemption for the people of Israel. And so it does matter kind of what's the thing that's going on in her head. One other place we see this, and this is a verse we're going to use to read, we're going to use both of these verses to read this little midrash that we have just been saying a lot recently in Hallel, is another place where the idea that a barren woman then bears children kind of unexpectedly is a metaphor for redemption, right? Moshivi akeret habayit em habanim smecha, hallelujah. Who he seats the barren woman in her home. You can have a lot of fun with Bible commentaries trying to understand this very simple word, habayit. A mother with children. And again, that seems like it's a metaphor for redemption, but it's also, let's imagine that it might be a kind of more literal thing. Okay, so what we're now going to see in the next text is an effort to match up the prophetic and later, prophetic prophets and Tehillim's picture of the barren woman who then bears children with the actual narratives of that in other parts of the Bible. So we're going to kind of plug one into the other, and in the course of that, kind of unpack the metaphor a little bit and try to kind of understand what it might mean if we're going to use it as a metaphor for what Israel's redemption looks like. So this is from Pesach de Rav Kahana, which is a kind of late midrashic text. And you're going to see that they sort of step through very, very elegantly. And I've bolded the verses for you because they kind of pop up again and again, and it helps you hopefully see the structure. Okay, so let's read. All right, so it starts, Pesach de Rav Kahana always starts with an initial verse that's kind of the heading. And so the heading we have here is Roni Akara, right, which is the verse we just had. The rejoice, O barren one. Okay. Oh, I told you I would bold verses, but I cheated on one of them. There we go. Okay. Moshivi akeret habayit em habanim smecha. The one who God seats the childless woman among her household as happy mother of children. All right. Sheva akarotain. There are 7 barren women. Sarah. Okay. Rivka, Rachel, Vilea, V'ishto shel Manoach, V'chana, that's 6. Who's going to be the 7th one? Zion, Zion. Okay, so all of these ones, most of them I think should be pretty familiar. Eshet Manoach is like a little bit of a weird case, but like basically these are kind of standard biblical stories. And Zion. Oh, I didn't know that Zion was a barren woman. Here I'm going to understand how Zion is like a barren woman. So what they're going to do is step through and connect up these verses with each of the characters in turn. And we're going to be aiming for the grand finale, which is Zion. Isn't Zion compared to a barren woman in Eicha? Yes. Yes. And in many other places. Also, in addition to the barren woman comparison, which I'm like interested in kind of excavating and using for our own purposes, there's a lot of like unfaithful or kind of prostituting language that's also used for thinking about Zion as a woman, which I'll say I am less excited about than I am excited about this, but you know, it's all there. Yeah, so it is in Eicha, and it's also like Zion is compared to a barren woman who's then like, maybe she has children that they've died and she's mourning and like things go south in Eicha as they tend to do. Okay, good. So now we're going to move through each one. Moshi ve'akeret habayit zo imenu Sarah. That refers to Sarah. V'tiyeh Sarah akara, because it says that Sarah was barren. Easy verse, no problems. Eim habanim smecha. When does she become the happy mother of children? Hanika banim Sarah. That Sarah would suckle children. I want you to notice something. Anybody remember where this verse comes from? This little fragment? This isn't when she actually does suckle the children, Because by the time that's happening, right, by the time Yitzchak is like weaned, Sarah has kind of basically left the scene in a lot of ways. No, this is Abraham being like, oh my God, I never thought that I would see that happen. So there's something interesting going on there. It's not really a verse about her at all, versus the one, right? Sarah, Tie Sarai Akara, really is about her. So there's something interesting going on there. All right. I think it's also just worth noting before we move on, and we're going to see this theme pop up again and again as we go. Eim habanim semecha. Is that actually what happens in this narrative? Well, maybe. Sarah's childbearing becomes very complicated. She has, like, her child ends up in a kind of horrible rivalry situation. Then Abraham tries to sacrifice him. Then she dies pretty quickly after that, and at least in rabbinic imagination, dies because of that incident. So this is not like, it's sort of, the text is tricking you, the midrash is tricking you into thinking that this story turned out well. But it turned out in a much more complicated way, right? It wants you to end with redemption, but it's not quite that. Okay, same maneuver. Davar acher, new one. Moshi v'yakeret habayit zo Rivka. That refers to Rivka. V'yater Yitzchak la'Hashem l'nochach ishto ki akarahi. Right? This was like 2 parshiot ago. Isaac pleaded with God on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Notice again, this is Isaac and not her, but okay. Eim habanim smecha v'yater lo Hashem v'tahar Rivka ishto. She becomes the mother of children, the happy mother of children, because, right, Isaac prays and she she becomes pregnant. Okay, fine. Again here, I think you can complicate the picture of Eim habanim smecha, because already she also has a very, like, right, we get his prayer, we don't get hers. Right? Her prayer is like, Lama za'anochi. Why is this? Why am I here? Like, why is this happening to me? Which you can read all kinds of ways. You can read that as like, this is a horrible pregnancy and like, how am I going to survive it? You can read it as like, I don't even want this in the first place. Like, there are lots of options there for how to read it, but it seems at minimum it's complicated. And certainly, like, when those twins are born, things get even more complicated because then they end up in this like horrible destructive rivalry with one another, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Fine. New one. Davar acher. Moshi v'yakeret habayit zo Leah. This is Leah. Fine. Vayar Hashem hisnu'a Leah. God saw that Leah was hated or unloved. Vayiftach et rachma, and he opened her womb. Okay. Mechan shahaita Leah akara. From here, we learn that Leah herself was an akara. Now, there's a little bit of a trick here, because the fact that they have to tell you this means that it's a little bit of a tough sell. Because the other ones, right, we didn't have to tell you that Sarah was akara. The text told us that. Now we have to tell you. Okay, it's a midrash. They're playing a little literary fun with us. Fine. Im habanim smecha ki yadaladiti lo sheish banim. All right, does anyone remember this context of this pasuk? This is, maybe my husband will like me now because I have borne him 6 sons. Also a kind of tragic and horrible story that has gone wrong, right? She bears all these children, but it never quite works out for her. All right. One more. Davar acher, Moshi v'yakeret habayit, zo ishto shel Manoach, vayar malach Hashem el isha vayomar, ela hinena et akara v'lo yaladet. Eim habanim smecha, v'harit v'yaladet ben. Then she has a child. Okay, so here's like, this one is the one that, right, I told you before that the midrash had to kind of shoehorn in a little. In my reading, this is the one you have to shoehorn in, because Manoach's wife's children end up in all kinds of complicated political dealings that aren't as horrible as the preceding stories, but are still like not excellent. Okay. And then we have the last one, also famous. Davar acher moshivi akeret habayit zo Hannah. This is Hannah. Vayu lipnina yeladim, ulechana ein yeladim. Pnina had children, but Hannah did not. Banim. Oh, sorry. Okay. Em habanim smecha. V'tar vatelet shlosha banim u'shtei banot. Happy mother of children refers to Hannah conceiving and bearing 3 sons and 2 daughters. Okay, right? Hannah gives birth to Shmuel. Shmuel then presides over all kinds of bad political situations for the people in various ways. So these last 2, I think, don't fit my interpretation quite as nicely, but there we have it. All right. And then the kind of, well, actually, before we get to the piece de resistance, I want to then ask, what are they doing? Right? The rabbis know all the things I just pointed out to you. They get that. They know their Bible better than I do. Didn't take rocket science to figure out that like things didn't turn out so well for Sarah. So what are they trying to do here? I want to suggest to you that one thing they're trying to do is direct your attention away from what happens to the kids. Right? They're kind of like, they're papering that over and sort of getting you like, that's not the point of this story. The point is her expectation and desire to have children that ends up to have children that is unfulfilled for a very long time, and then God kind of sweeping in and redeeming her. And what happens afterwards is kind of off screen, right? It's hidden and is not totally paid attention to, potentially to her at her expense. Yeah, Elle, was that a hand?
Yes. Is this okay to participate?
Yes, lovely. Please join the conversation.
Well, one thing that I've been thinking as you've been reading through each one, the fact that life is real after a woman has children doesn't mean that she isn't a happy mother of children.
Yeah, good. Okay, right.
So we don't live in a Pampers commercial, live in real life, and I think it sort of illustrates, yes, there is reality, and yes, there will be all sorts of real relationships between the children, between the parents and the children, but that doesn't mean that your life isn't fulfilled when you become a mother.
Right. So I think in a way, like what you've opened up for us is to think about, yeah, like it is horrible that, for example, like Rivka's children end up hating one another. But that's not really that's like, doesn't take away from her being also a happy mother of children in some kind of deeper and more intense sense. I think that's really beautiful and really helpful for kind of seeing some of the dynamics here. I wonder then if we kind of flip the metaphor back around, right? When Tehillim is saying, Moshiva keret habayit em habanim smecha, if we have a vision of redemption that's not like everything is great and we all are so happy and we like live in a Pampers commercial, right, to use your phrase, but instead like life is real, things get complicated, and maybe the children end up hitting each other, and maybe like your crazy husband decides to take your kid off and try to sacrifice him on a mountain. Like maybe these crazy things happen, but there's still a version of redemption that's kind of made possible.
Yes.
Right? I think that's like a really powerful way to reread this line. And I've never read it back into the Psalm, which like I think can be really, really powerful. So next time you say Hallel, I want everybody to think back to reading it in this more complex way, and a picture of redemption that's a little more complex. Okay. Yeah, that's a lovely insight. So I think what they are in a certain way, though, I think the dynamic kind of textually that they're pulling out for you is like, there's something that she doesn't have in each case that she wants and that is impossible for her, and God intervenes and makes it possible. Right? And then whatever happens. But that's the dynamic of redemption, and both, right? Like to the extent that they have to do some work to show that Leah was really quote unquote akara, they need to kind of prove it to you. So that state is important in a kind of anticipation of redemption mode. All right, so let's see the last one. Davar acher. Moshi ve'acheret habayit, zot Zion. This is Zion. Roni akara lo yelda. All right, good proof text. How do we know that Zion is an akara? Because we have this nice verse where that uses that metaphor. Very good. It's good that we had that verse from prophets right at the start. Eim habanim semecha ve'amarta bilvavcha mi yalid li et ele v'gomer. You will say to yourself, who bore these for me? All right, so if you're Chazal, then you actually have all of these verses like stored up in your brain. But if you're not Chazal and you're me, you need to look them up in a book. Luckily for you, here they are in the sheet. So I want to just open this out and see what they're doing with the verse. Okay, so this is a section from Isaiah which gives you another of these visions of what the redemption will be like. Maharu banayich umaharsaich or maribayich mimech vayetzu. Your children are coming, right? Those who have ruined and savaged you are going to leave. Your children are coming. So this is kind of textually related to some of the Eicha tropes that John is pointing to. I think Akev, that sounds possible, that it's the Haftarah for Akev. I don't have a memory for these things, so I believe you. Okay. Se'is aviv einech, uri kulam nikbetzu uvaulach. Chai ani ne'um Hashem, ki chulam ka'adi, tilbashi v'tiksharim kakala. All right. So look up around you, they're all here, and God says, you shall wear them all like jewels, deck yourself out like a bride, a kind of reliving of the kind of how the story is supposed to go. All right. Ki harbanayich v'shemamotayich ve'eretz hasurotayich ki atati trim miyoshi v'rechaku mibalayich. All right. So all of your crowded streets, everything will be crowded and lovely, and your destroyers who killed everyone and left things empty are going to be gone. So far, so good. Here's where things get important. All right. Odiomru be'oznayich b'nei shekulayich sarli hamakom gushali ve'esheva. All right. So the children you thought you had lost will settle and say to you, this place is too crowded for me. There's not enough space. Make room for me, because there'll be so many of them coming back. All right, and now's the verse that you're going to quote. Ve'amarta bilvavech mi yalid li et ela. Who bore these for me? Ve'ani shechula gluda gola v'sura ve'ele mi gidel hein ani nisharti livadi ela efohem. Who brought these? Who bore them? I.e., wasn't me who bore them, right? And who raised them? I was alone and childless. Where do they all go? Like, where do they all come from? How did this all work? All right. So then, think about this. So it seems like here, right? Just inside if you just read this text from Yeshayahu with no other stuff sort of sneaking in, what's going on? Well, exile is ending, everyone's coming back, everything's going to be great. Zion is bringing in her children, and it's like, oh my gosh, how did you multiply so much when I wasn't even there? All right, but if we sort of flip it back on like what's the metaphor that's being used here, who's the person? There's a story that's being told where the mother figure, who is Zion, had children born for her by someone else, right? And her question is like, who did this for me? And that's the metaphor that we're going to use for Israel's redemption. right? So Israel's redemption in a certain way is parallel to the redemption of Sarah and Rivka and Leah and Hannah and Eshet Manoach, but in a, right, because there are no children and then suddenly there are. But there's something different about it because actually the children are, first of all, born by someone else, right? There's a kind of almost surrogacy going on here. So the children are born by someone else, and also there's potentially also the loss of children who we didn't see, which we didn't see in the other stories, right? So depending on how you read this, you might say the woman who's being imagined in this past in Isaiah has children who then are gone, or then she thinks have died, and then they come back, and but then you have to do like mi yalidli et Eila, who bore these for me, who did that, like. So there's some kind of I don't want to say disconnect, but there's some kind of different mode of children being born, kind of capital B, that is being played out in this text than in some of the other biblical narratives that we've seen. All right. So what I want to suggest then is that the model in this midrash for Israel's redemption, and the model of the experience of waiting for redemption, is the model of the barren woman who's like praying to conceive, and then eventually God kind of intervenes. Or even the barren woman, I hate that term, but whatever, okay, who then like has a surrogate who sweeps in and helps. Or we can imagine all kinds of other complicated scenarios where like, who did this for me? How was this even made possible? Yeah, Elle.
You're really stimulating. Perhaps the last paragraph could be read as a rhetorical question, and the answer to that is Hashem. This is Zion. The Shekhinah feels so despondent and so empty. All of her children are gone and dead. And then she turns around and they're all there again. Hashem did this miracle.
Yeah.
I think this is a feeling that someone can have, that you're despondent and desolate one moment, and the next moment your life is filled, and Hashem did it.
Right. And I think that's a sort of Hannah model, right? Where like she is desperate and then God just does it. And it kind of just happens. I think that's right. I think it, and so I think certainly in the biblical text on its own, mi yalid et Eila is like, who did this for me? God did it, because like there's no other, that's the only possible explanation this could even have. Like that's the only way it could make any sense. But there's a kind of wonderment at like, these in some sense, these children are mine, but there's also a sense in which someone else did the bearing. Or, I mean, I think you could also read this potentially as like someone did the midwifing. Either way, those options are sort of available. But what I want to suggest to you is that, like, right, I said a few minutes ago that what I wanted to try to do was to convince you that the model of care of the woman carrying the stone so she doesn't miscarry, or the child wrapping the string around his arm because he misses his father, that sort of expression of longing for someone who's not there, or maybe doesn't even yet exist in any kind of full way, is kind of central to the tradition. And it's actually the model that we use to think about what redemption even is from the get-go. So that, I think, helps us kind of if we go back to what Benjamin was saying at the beginning, and what we spent a lot of time with Benjamin last week, lets you reimagine thinking about an ethics of care not only as about responding to some concrete, specific person, this child right now needs this, but instead to think, that's one experience of care that's really important. And there are these other experiences that are actually about longing for something that's absent. and that longing can itself be something really powerful and a kind of has a religious meaning in the tradition as a kind of expectant hoping for redemption. And so those experiences in our own lives can both help us kind of unlock what is the like biblical, what's the sort of narrative for the people, but also and potentially also like lend some meaning to those experiences, which can be really, really difficult to be inside of in lots of different ways. So I think I wanted you to see this kind of different mode of potentially doing ethics of care, because I think it opens up the range of experiences that we might be able to consider as resources. All right. So just like I just gave you this passage from Benjamin just as a like little quick reminder of like what's going on, right? This is the passage we saw last week. The entirety of my child cannot be apprehended without the backdrop of the familiar and vice versa. I can't understand my child is different from me without some sense of like the way in which the child is like me. Fine, just jump to the last sentence. The specific command can only be heard in the immediacy of one particular child at a particular moment. And what I want to suggest to you is that like in the kind of Roni Akara version of this story, actually it's not one particular child at all. It's this imagined or absent being. Okay. So what I want to do in our last few minutes is actually go back to where we started. So in the first week, we read this incredibly sweet, wonderful midrash. And we spent some time thinking about kind of what are the different models of care that are in the midrash. And I want to now use our like new framework to see if we can see this midrash in a different light than we saw it the last time. So I think I actually will read the whole thing, but fairly quickly so we remember the plot. What's going on here is we're trying to explain the verse Ze'eli ve'anvehu. This is my God and I will enshrine him or something. What does it mean, Ze'eli? Who am I pointing to? And this midrash is an explanation of that question. All right. Rabbi Yehuda said, Mi amar kilus lakadosh baruch hu, who said praise to God at the Song of the Sea? Hatinokot, the children or even babies. We'll spend some time figuring out how old they are if you haven't, or we did first time, and if you can remember. Okay. The children who Paro wanted to throw into the ocean because those children know God. All right, what does that even mean? Ketzad, good question. Kishahayu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim hayta isha bibnot Yisrael mivakeshet lelid v'hayta yotzit lasadeh v'yoledet sham. V'kevan shahayta yoledet ozevet hanar umoseret oto lekadosh baruch hu ve'omeret ribon ha'olam ani asiti et sheli ata aseh et shalach. So God, when an Israelite woman was about to give birth, she would go out into the field and give birth, and then she would leave the child there and say to God, I did what I was supposed to do. Now your turn. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, miyad haya yored hakadosh baruch hu bichvodo kivyachol. God would come down. V'chotech tiburan umechitzan v'sachan. V'chein Yechezkel Amar v'tushluch el pnai hasadeh b'noga nafshach uchtiv u'meladatich b'yom huledet otchach lo charat sharach uktiv ve'al b'yishrech mam uktiv, etc., etc. So God would cut the umbilical cord and wash the child and anoint them, as it says in Yechezkel, I did all of those things for you. Right, so you were lying, and then I cut your umbilical cord, and I clothed you, and I bathed you in water, etc. The whole thing. Okay, good. Vayinikuhu dvash misela, and I suckled them with milk and honey. V'hayu gedolim basadeh, and they would grow there in the field. Shene'emar rivava katzemach chatzadeh natatich. I made you grow like the field. V'kivan shehayu gedolim, hayu nichlasin levaktehen etzel avotehen. V'hayu sho'alin lahem, mi haya zakuk lahem. They would go back to their houses and their parents would ask, who took care of you? Like, how did this happen, right? Presumably, like, the mother at least seems to think either that God will take care of this child, or she says that in anger and nobody knows what's going to happen to this child. והיו אומרים להם, בחור אחד נאה ומשובח היה יורד ועושה לנו כל צרכיו, שנאמר, דודי צח ואדון דגול מרבבה. All right, so who took care of you? A nice looking young man came down and took care of everything we needed. וכיוון שבאו ישראל לים, היו אותן התינוקות שם, והם ראו לקדוש ברוך הוא, וים, והתחילו אומרים לאבותיהם, זהו אותו שהיה עושה לנו כל אותן הדברים, כשהיינו במצרים. This is the person who did all of those things for us in Egypt. שנאמר, זה אלי וענווה. Right, so the reading here is the children point and say, this is God. God took care of me. And when we read this midrash the last time, one of the things we spent some time talking about was the way that God cares for the children. And that's a kind of theological model for us, for how we should be. But it's also a kind of a source for thinking about care as potentially central to the Jewish tradition. I want to focus our attention not on God caring for the kids, but on the mothers. We did a little bit of that last time, but I want to do it kind of more deeply with this other stuff in mind. Because in a way, the mothers in this story have a kind of Isaiah-like experience in that they have these children. They basically leave them for dead. And then they come back and they say, who took care of you? Like, who did this? Right? So there's a version of the kind of mi yalid et eleh story. And so if we do that, I think there's a sort of potential redemptive story that goes on, not for the children who survive and can stand at the sea and say, this is the God who did it, but the more complicated, like, okay, God, this is in your hands now voice. And also the parent who thinks that they've lost their child, or maybe hopes one day that their child will come back and perform some kind of, right? We don't know what the women are doing, both parents, but certainly we don't know what the mothers are doing in the interim period, other than like watching the kind of worsening of the situation around them. But I want to suggest that actually they're also waiting for redemption in a kind of way, and that whatever it is that they're doing in the waiting for redemption is itself religiously significant and kind of can be excavated. So what I want to suggest to you by the end of this series is that actually the model of these women who are waiting for their children to be restored is also a model of care, but it's a model of care for somebody who's not present. But there's something in kind of either keeping the hope alive or in nursing a certain kind of anger at God, depending on how you want to read Ani asiti et sheli v'ata useh shalach. You could read it either way. But there's something kind of valuable religiously there that is worth holding on to as an alternative model to the kind of like either God just, look at God cares for us and so we care for others, but also forms of care that we might not like recognize as central or important. So that's where I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with one other small thought, which is that in the rabbinic mind, the redemption can be brought about by the mitzvot themselves, right? So if all of Israel kept Shabbat, then the redemption would come tomorrow. All kinds of different models for thinking about this. Certainly, like there's all kinds of what we call theurgic models where like, you do a mitzvah and that brings the redemption closer. But all of those kinds of ways of thinking are in themselves a way of performing this kind of expectation and hope that is also based on a loss, right? The redemption hasn't come. We're not here. We are expecting something. We're hoping for something that's not quite there yet. And that actually might be just what mitzvot are in some important way. And so it doesn't have to be kind of what Benjamin sets out, where like tefillin are about performing your membership in the nation and celebrating the redemption that's already happened. Actually, tefillin are in some sense closer to this like to an experience that's often described in feminine terms, first of all. And second of all, is an experience that's about longing for somebody who's not there. And it's sort of more the like boys going out with their knots or the women going out with their preservation stone model of thinking about what mitzvot are and what redemption might be. So thank you very much. It has been a joy to learn with you these 3 weeks.
Thank you, Sarah, for this very, very, very interesting final class in this series. I'll miss you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our full program tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. with the final session on virtual reality and genuine humanity. Can they coexist, with Rabbi Zager? In addition, we have many more classes happening right now, and always you can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again, Sarah, for the opportunity to learn with you.
Thank you so much.
3 classes. And thanks again to everyone who attended. We hope to see you soon tomorrow evening at Rabbi Zager's class and in future classes here at Drisha. Have a wonderful night.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.